أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today's sacred text message is taken from the chapter known as Ar-Ra'd, which is thunder, and it's the 41st ayah in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says أَوَلَمْ يَرَوْا أَنَّا نَأْتِي الْأَرْضَ نَنْقُصُهَا مِنْ أَطْرَافِهَا. Haven't they seen how we diminish the earth from its edges? نَنْقُصُهَا مِنْ أَطْرَافِهَا. And then it says وَاللَّهُ يَحْكُمُ لَا مُعَقِّبَ لِحُكْمِهِ وَهُوَ سَرِيعُ الْحِسَابِ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who makes the ultimate judge, and no one can overrule his judgment, and he is quick to reckoning. So what's interesting about this verse is that while we know that there is a constant diminishment of the edges of the earth with the ocean, so there's always, the ocean is eroding, there's a constant erosion. So the outward meaning is perfectly understandable, but this was obviously not something that the Mufassirun understood, because this comes out of geology and understanding about erosion and things like that. I mean, I suppose somebody could work that out by just looking at beaches and things like that, but most people thought it was always like that. That would be the average thinking. So the way that they understood that, and this comes out of some really extraordinary statements about the Salaf, that they understood the nuqsan, or the diminishment of it, to be the death of scholars. That as the scholars die, there's a loss of a part of the main. There's a loss of the continent, something of the continent, when we lose these great scholars. And so I just wanted to do a reflection on the loss of a really, really, truly great scholar, who we've lost a few just in the last few weeks. I know Sheikh Rayyan of Egypt, rahimahullah. I did not know him, but I saw pictures of him. He was just this beautiful face. Simahum fi wujuhihim. You know, their signs are in their faces. And I know that Sheikh Walid, my brother on the East Coast, told me that he had studied with him, and that he was really truly one of the giants. He was the Maliki faqih and teacher in Al-Qahira. And then also there was some of the Habaib have passed away. And I'm sure there's other scholars around the world, because scholars, a lot of them are elderly, especially the great ones, and we're losing them. But the scholar that I'd like to talk about today was one of my teachers, even though I studied with him for a very brief time, but I did study considerably with his son, so I have a connection to him, a very strong connection through his son, and that was Sheikh Marabt Ahmed Fal al-Amsami. He had a really extraordinary madrasa in what's known as Ain al-Khashba in central Mauritania, and he was just a really stunning scholar. One of the things I think that everybody who visited him was struck by was, one, his countenance. He had a really beautiful face, a lot of light. People talk about he has light in his face, and there was genuinely light there for people that did have the opportunity to see him and experience him personally. Some of that comes through with some of the photographs of him, but he had studied with Marabt al-Hajj in the 1960s. He spent, I think he went there in 1958 and stayed until 1968. He actually married Marabt al-Hajj's daughter, and so she gave birth to a really extraordinary young man who is now a full-fledged scholar in his own right, and really, I think, a exceptional scholar. And that's Marabt Abdullah Wald Ahmedna, who teaches in Tuwaymarat now. He's the son of Marabt Ahmed Fal, and he lived with me in California for some time. He actually memorized al-Bukhari in my house, so it was quite extraordinary to see him just memorizing this book by rote. But really, really amazing scholar and just a man of incredible piety. But Murabita Ahmed Fall studied for 10 years, and when we say studied for 10 years, I'm talking about 5 days a week for several hours every day. It's much more intense the way the Mauritanians study than the way we study in the West. A lot of it involves rote memorization, and some people look at the Mauritanians. I've heard some of the Eastern people say this about the Mauritanians, and I've always felt it was there's a tinge of envy in it. They say things like, "Oh, well, they memorize, but they don't really understand it," and things like that, which is absolutely calumny against the Mauritanian scholars. Because while that is true for some students of knowledge, and always will be, there are people that have good memories but poor understanding, and there's people that have really excellent understanding and poor memories. So you get, in fact, it's quite rare to get the two together, according to Imam Suyuti, who said that he was one of those rare events himself. But in Mauritania, it's not rare. It's actually the norm amongst the great scholars. And Murabit in Mauritania is not your average person. The Murabit is somebody who actually has a college and is teaching and has reached a real level of mastery. And these are people that it's hard for us in the West to imagine them. So just to give you an example, they memorize the Quran early, usually in the first 5 years of their study. But their memorization of the Quran is not like the Quran is memorized in Egypt or in Pakistan or in other places. When the Mauritanians memorize the Quran, they memorize both riwayah of Nafi'. So Asim has two rawat. People that memorize the Quran in most places only know one of the riwayat of Imam Asim, whereas the Mauritanians learn both Qalun and Warsh. And then they study tajweed, and then they study rasm. So they don't consider you a hafidh unless you can actually write the entire Quran without making any orthographical mistakes. Because they say that's the meaning of hafidh, is somebody who preserves the Quran, not just the sounds of the Quran, but actually how to write it so that the rasm al-Uthmani could never disappear from the earth. So if all the mushafs were burnt, la qadar Allah, but if all the mushafs on the planet were burnt, there would be Mauritanian scholars that could write it from scratch and reprint it as it was, and that's that's a reality. So he studied with his father first, Murabita Ahmed Fall, and he learned the basic text of that they study there. When the Mauritanians first they learn the Quran, but then they learn they'll read like Al-Akhdari in prayer, to learn a basic prayer, and it has a beautiful little section on what we believe, and then on some what would traditionally be called tasawwuf, or things about purification of the heart. And it has a wonderful section in about the illuminating nature of the prayer. So that was the text, the first text that I studied was that, and I didn't do the poem. I actually did the nathar and memorized the whole nathar, which was a little harder than the poem. A lot of the students studied the poem, but and then he learned the next one was Ibn Ashar, and then he studied like creed. They usually study initially a basic creed, like Al-Bulaim, which is from one of their texts, and then the Ajarumiyya in grammar. And then when he did those basic things, he set out to study with Murabt al-Hajj wal-Fahfu in Taganet, and he studied with him all of the mutun that they study in the Mauritanian madrasa, which included memorizing the entire text of Khalil, which is a formidable task in and of itself. And he actually studied it twice with Murabt al-Hajj. So he read it once with memorization, and then did a second because it's a difficult text, and it's written in a very, very abstruse, succinct language that just reading the text without commentary is not easy. Some of it can be read, but some of it definitely needs some type of commentary to fill in the gaps. And then he also studied usul al-fiqh. he mastered all of the texts of Arabic that they use there. So that would mean the Ajurumiyya, Mulhat al-Arab of Imam al-Hariri, which is over 300 lines memorized. And usually they learn with those all of the shawahid, or the examples from poetry and things. And then he learned the Alfiya of Ibn Malik, and then he studied the Ihmirar of Bin Buna, which is like all of the things that are absent from the Alfiya that are in there. So there's a lot of really interesting. So the total of it is literally several thousand lines of poetry just in grammar, to master grammar. And then he studied logic, and then he studied rhetoric. These are the real fundamental sciences of of our tradition, Islamic scholastic tradition, which we in the West call the trivium. So these are also the fundamental sciences. So we share that with the West, and that's one of the things that we're really trying to revive in Zaytuna, because while it's still taught to a certain degree in a lot of the traditional schools in the Muslim world, unfortunately it's really, really rarely taught anymore in the West, except by Christians who recognize the importance of it to study their own tradition. And then in 1968, he went and he established his own madrasa after studying with Murabit al-Hajj for several years, and began taking students. Very profoundly pious man, had a deeply dyed spirituality. One of the things that was noted about him was that he really took on the practices of his teacher. Murabit al-Hajj, I was told by one of the people that had known him for over 70 years, he said that he is absolutely certain that nobody's ever heard him speak ill of any human being. Murabit al-Hajj. And Murabit Ahmed Fal was like that, which is really just a stunning testimony to uprightness, because it's just so difficult for people not to speak about other people. Sidi Ahmed Zarruq says one of the most dangerous questions you'll ever ask is, how's so-and-so? Because he said it opens the door to backbiting. And people now, they backbite with impunity. They don't really think about it. They talk about people. Even rolling the eyes is considered backbiting if somebody's name is mentioned. All these type things. So it's not just the words. And now we have texting to people to help them facilitate their sinfulness, and internet comments, things like that. It's really amazing. So, but he was noted for that, like just total uprightness. He comes from the Masuma clan, which the Zawaya in Mauritania are basically the scholastic masters of the Mauritanian tradition. So Mauritania has a very interesting. It's actually very similar to how India, the Hindus, have their stratification. So you have the Brahman, and those are the Zawaya clans. Those are the people of study and devotion, intellect. And then you have the what they call the Arab, which are the Kashtiya in the caste system that they have in India. These are the warrior clans. And then you have the Sunna, which are like the Vaishya clans in Hinduism. And then you have the Haratin, and then you have the Zanaga, which the Zanaga also are akin to the Vaishya class probably, but they really stratify, and it was originally introduced many centuries ago as a way of just having a functioning society. So each group, it was really like a kind of in management, it's basically a division of labor. Essentially, that's what it would be called. One of the things about Hinduism, which is interesting, even though they codified it in their religion, these are natural phenomena in every human society. So if you look in the United States, for instance, we have the warrior class. The Kashtiya would be the military and the police, and then we have like the Brahmins. Those are all the educators, the university professors, and also the political class is supposed to be like that, even though they're very often are wanting. And then you have the Vaishya, which would be like the merchants and the commercial class. And then you have like the like people who serve our utilities, people that do those difficult jobs that a lot of people don't want to do. People like sanitation engineers, people that work in junkyards and other places. I mean, those are all jobs that need to be done, but it's a difficult job for people to do. So these are natural phenomena in societies. It's a very unusual aspect of life on Earth that these things don't go away for some reason. I mean, obviously, you don't want to see it proliferate. So a healthy society should do everything they can to mitigate these phenomena like homelessness and things like that. But they seem to be part of the world as far as we can tell, because they've always been around. So the Mauritanians have that interesting diversification of talent. And so the Brahmin class, this Zawaya class, they really, really take study very seriously. And Murabt Ahmed Fad was a great example of that, of somebody who really, really went deeply into the sciences of Islam and could teach without notes all of these different sciences. I once heard Sheikh Muhammad Hassan Waldadu told me in my house, he visited me once in my house, and he said to me, you know, that he could dictate 40 books in 40 sciences right now. And he wasn't boasting, he was just making a statement of fact. And there's a lot of truth to that. A Mauritanian, a master like Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya could easily right now do an entire course on usul al-fiqh without having any recourse to notes. In fact, his book, which is called Amali al-Dalalat, which is now a textbook in Al-Azhar and several other colleges, Amali are dictations. He literally gave that book were lectures that he gave without any notes, and then it was transcribed, edited, and put into a book. And he can do it off the top of his head. I was once sitting with him, and somebody mentioned something that he'd read in a book by another scholar. I won't mention his name, people might recognize it, but he mentioned another scholar, and I said, I don't think that's the dominant opinion. I think that's a weak opinion. And I said, but let's wait till Sheikh Abdullah comes in and ask him. So, because he was out. And so he came in, this was in Jeddah, and he came in, and I said, it was actually my friend Ahmed Shugeri who had asked the question. I said, Ahmed Shugeri was reading this book, and he mentioned that the scholar said this. And Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya said, He said, well, there's 8 opinions on that topic, and then he enumerated the 8th, and then he said, but that's probably the weakest, so it's surprising that he would mention that opinion. Another time I saw a very notable Azhari scholar who was younger, who came in and gave Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya his book on usul al-fiqh. This is a true story. And Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya opened the book, and he read, just in the middle of the book, and he read a section, and then he just said to him, and he would never do this like other than, I think, to as a teaching, the reason he did this, but he literally opened the book and he said, you're quoting Imam al-Ghazali here, but that's actually not his opinion. He mentioned that in this book, but actually his final opinion that he landed on is in the Mustasfa, and actually goes against this opinion. So you should make that correction the next time you print the book, because that was not his position at the end of his life. But that's an example of a real master, and this is part of the danger of writing books before we're prepared to write books, because it's just the amount of knowledge you have to do, especially when it's Islamic knowledge. One of the interesting things about Murabt Ahmed Fad, rahimahullah, is that he didn't write much. He did write, he has a lot of responsa, or what we would call fatawa. But he didn't write much because the Mauritanians, the ulama tend to teach all the time, and so they don't have a lot of time to write when they run their schools. And I once asked his son if he would consider writing a commentary on Ibn Ashur that had dalils. And he said, Astaghfirullah, who am I to write a commentary on Ibn Ashir? And that's how they feel. There's a real sincere humility because they understand the level of knowledge that you have to do to have to do such things, and also the fear of just having to be responsible for that in the afterlife, of giving people guidance. So these are momentous things. But he was a beautiful man, and I'll just mention something really interesting. And I've written an obituary about him, and you can, if you go onto Sandala's website, you can find the obituary and see some pictures of him. But one of the, and I'll just close in saying this, that one of the really interesting things is that I was sitting with him once, and we were talking about Marabt al-Hajj, who he had studied with, and I had studied with him for a much shorter time than he had. But nonetheless, we both benefited, immensely in the time that I spent with him, which was much less. But just any time with such people is just such a benefit. But he then talked about how fortunate we were to have him, because Marabt al-Hajj at the time was still alive. And he said that these people are the warathatul anbiya, as if he wasn't one of them. And then he recited these lines: لعمرك ما الرزية فقد مال ولا فرس تموت ولا بعير ولكن الرزية فقد قرم يموت بموته خلق كثير, which basically translates as calamity is not loss of wealth or the death of a mare or a dromedary. The real calamity is the death of a sayyid, a qarm, somebody who's a sayyid, like a master. The sayyid in Arabic is the one that you flee to in times of tribulation, who a source of refuge, and that's what the great scholars are. And obviously the Ahl al-Bayt are called Sada, because traditionally Muslims would yatawassalu bihim, like Omar tawassara bi Abbas. He said, we used to make tawassul with the Prophet, and now we make tawassul with Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ. So the Sada traditionally were people that people would go to them in times of calamity, and they would ask them to pray in hopes that because they were relatives of the Prophet, it would be answered. So the Sayyid is somebody that you need in difficult times. And he said, so that the real calamity is the death of a Sayyid, who when he dies, multitudes die with him. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless Marabt Ahmad Fah and give him light in his grave, and may all the men and women that benefited from him be in his mizan on the Day of Judgment, in his scales, inshallah, and may we be worthy of transmitting whatever he might have taught us, inshallah. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you. These scholars, many of them are leaving us now, and to be really, really, and I'll say this in all absolute sincerity. When I went to Mauritania for the first time, which it was in the early 80s, I saw something that really was quite unusual. People think I romanticized it, but they don't know what I saw there. And just to give you a glimpse of it, when I was in a small town called Geru, and one night I was with somebody named Muhammad al-Masumi, who actually died from cancer and is buried in Granada. He's from Marabt al-Hajj's clan. And he and I walked up there's near Sheikh Khatri bin Boiba's house. We walked up onto this huge mountain of sand. It was just, Kathib. And it overlooked this stunning city that you just couldn't have imagined it, because it's so vivid in my mind what I saw right now. This is almost 40 years later, and it's just so vivid in my mind that I can almost see it. And it was all mud houses. There was no electricity. This was after Isha, and it was really, really dark. The diamond sky was completely illuminated with stars. And if you've ever been in deep desert on a clear night, you know what I'm talking about. Just extraordinary. And I'm overlooking this beautiful city and there was enough moonlight to just see the city. It seemed as if from every single house, the Quran was being recited, and it was like a humming of bees. The entire village was reciting the Quran. And it was, I just started weeping. Just to see something like that, like a whole city reciting the Quran at night. And years later, I came back to the city, and every house had a satellite dish on it. And there were all these electrical wires everywhere. And there wasn't that Quran anymore. And I felt like, what does this mean? Because for hundreds of years, that's the way that town was. And just to change in such a rapid time was something so strange to see. And so when I say this, I mean, I can honestly say, people can say I romanticized it or not. I know what I saw, and I know what was there, and I know what's been lost. And even though there's still a lot of good in Mauritania, there's still a deeply religious culture. The changes that I've seen in Mauritania, they're overwhelming.